I'd like to hear actually Yascha's perspective on something. It would be neat to hear you explain how the concept of the Overton window interacts with your ideals of liberalism. My perception of the intellectual history of the 20th century is that the Overton window has tremendously contracted over the last 100 years.
Look, I think that in liberal societies, we have much greater freedoms to express different views from what the government believes, from what the powerful people believe, than in virtually any other system in the world. I would much rather voice an unpopular opinion tonight here in London than I would in Beijing or in Caracas in Venezuela or in many, many other countries around the world.
Well, Minna, let me pick you up on that, because we're moving on to the main debate subject, and it's rather appropriate to what you were saying, because the question is, can any political ideology be neutral, or are they all necessarily partisan? And if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, you're saying that liberalism has effectively been white male liberalism, but can any ideology be other than that, in a sense? Would it always have the colour of the people who control it or invent it?
It's not that it would have the colour of the people who invent it, necessarily, but per definition, a political ideology cannot be neutral.
No.
I mean, what makes a political ideology one is the fact that it has an idea of what the world is and the vision of what the world should be, right? So again, as a feminist, it means that I'm subscribing to a worldview about feminist ideas about justice or authority or power.
So feminism isn't neutral.
So it's not neutral, and likewise, liberalism is not neutral. So I think, it's an impossibility. And so the question again is why we even constantly are having the conversation about whether something so obvious as the lack of neutrality actually exists.
Okay, Yascha.
Well, let me clarify something very important here, because no liberal would say that the ideology is neutral between, for example, girls suffering female genital mutilation or being able to self-determine, between people being allowed to practice their faith freely or having to go to a particular church, a particular mosque, a particular synagogue, because that's what the government or their parents say. There's all kinds of values that liberalism is based on. And the fundamental value that it is based on is the idea that we want individuals to be able to make their own choices. And this doesn't mean that we assume that everybody thinks at the age of 18, oh my God, I have no attachments in the world, I'm going to reinvent my life completely. Some people might do that. Most people are going to continue to be parts of the families they're part of, with the duties that implies, the religious networks they're a part of, the nations they're a part of. But if they want to change, if they say, I don't want to go to the same church as my parents did, I don't want to have the same kind of marriage that my parents did, then they must be free to do that. And so we absolutely believe in the importance and the value of values like freedom and of keeping the peace in these big, complex societies. But our answer as to how to do that is that we don't want a government that tells people how to live. But we think that there's a number of fundamental individual rights and liberties that citizens have to have versus the government, so that the government doesn't think it's our job to tell people what the good life is, that they should follow this religion, that they should or should not have this kind of sexual relationship, that they should or should not follow these kind of values. So, it's absolutely not true that liberals don't have values that shape the kind of policies that a state pursues. What is true is that the fundamental of those values is people need to have the freedom to self-determine, and that means it is not the job of the prime minister, of the king, of a president, or of a CEO dictator to tell you how to lead your life.
Let me let Minna back in on that, and I want to bring Curtis. Minna, what I think Yascha is saying, I don't want to misinterpret him, but is that liberalism effectively allows all forms of thought and view, and that's it. So would include feminism, would include everything else as well. It's not coloured in that sense by anything else.
That's great liberal feminism.
What I meant with the statement about colours, that I don't think a colour determines an ideology.
Yeah.
So not all women are feminists, not all black people are black liberation activists and so on. But liberalism, I mean, the question about its neutrality is not strictly speaking about, what its political philosophy is, but also how liberalism has been practiced throughout history. So when we look at the global order, which for a very long time has been dominated by liberalism, all of the very grandiose ideas that you've presented presented, which sound great in theory, but that's hardly how liberalism on a global scale has been practiced, and that's where the neutrality.
Judge it by what it does rather than what it says. Curtis, let me bring you in on this, because I don't think you are a liberal, or you wouldn't count yourself as one. But do you think any ideology, even whatever ideology you have, can be neutral in that sense? Does it make any sense to refer to it, or is everything partisan?
I have a question for Yascha.
Well, could you just answer that question first?
No, I don't. I don't believe that the concept of neutrality exists, and I think that it winds up very quickly disproving itself. I'd like to hear actually Yascha's perspective on something. It would be neat to hear you explain how the concept of the Overton window interacts with your ideals of liberalism.
Okay, I mean, just to explain, the Overton window being the area in this theory, which is actually of what is acceptable to talk about or
because my perception of the intellectual history of the 20th century is that the range of the Overton window has tremendously contracted over the last 100 years.
Okay, you've asked the question. Let me put it to Yascha briefly on that.
Well, let me answer both of these questions.
All right, if you can answer one about the Overton window first, and then we'll come on to the other.
So, look, I think that in liberal societies, we have much greater freedoms to express different views from what the government believes, from what the powerful people believe, than in virtually any other system in the world. I would much rather voice an unpopular opinion tonight here in London than I would in Beijing or in Caracas in Venezuela or in many, many other countries around the world. Which countries can you speak out freely and courageously, even if it's unpopular, without fear for your freedom and your career compared to democracy? Now, I agree.
One second, I'll bring you back in a minute.
I agree that unfortunately, over the last 10 or 20 years, many liberal democratic societies have become less liberal and have become less democratic because they have started to abridge those rights in ways that are very dangerous. I'm very worried and saddened that in the United Kingdom now, in 2023, over 10,000 people were arrested because of speech that they expressed online. That is a failure to live up to basic liberal principles, and I absolutely condemn it.
I'll let Curtis come back, and then we'll talk, as you wanted to, about what Minna's had to say. Curtis.
So, when you have an ideal, and every time the ideal is implemented, it leads to its own corruption, then maybe there's something wrong with the ideal. When you say in the last 10 to 20 years, first of all, the idea of overweighting the present as an example is, I feel an intellectual trick that should not be tolerated. We should compare our regime not only to the present, but also to the past. It's not the last 10 or 20 years. It's easily the last 100 years. And in fact, Tocqueville in Democracy in America says there is no country in the world that has as little freedom of thought as America, and he's referring to America literally 200 years ago.
Okay.
Now, so now we've actually managed to combine.
Fine. Address the combination.
No, which is fascinating, by the way, because it says a lot about this political moment and this debate. But somebody who supposedly is on the kind of feminist left and somebody who is on the tech CEO dictator right actually have.
We'll get on to that, but yes.
Exactly the same criticism of
Actually, before you make that claim, I would very much like to intervene.
Please,
because I don't think that Curtis and I share very much in common at all.
I think
you
agree.
Except for the fact that perhaps, yes, we do want both to think about the historical legacy of liberalism, but for very different reasons, I suspect. So lest Curtis and I are put in the same camp, I just want to say that my contention with liberalism is that there are actually some very dark ideologies that are influencing the world today, because liberalism is experiencing a downfall, and that's why we're having this conversation. Western hegemony, however, is not.
No.
It is very alive, and there are dark ideologies that are seeking to perpetuate Western hegemony at the cost of people around the world.
Can I speak?
So I'm going to finish my point. So what I want to say is that I believe that liberalism would benefit, even though I'm not a liberal, but there's a necessity for liberals to actually contend with their past so that they can, finally start to respond.
Okay, we've got the point on the history. If you come back briefly on that, and then I'll come to you.
Right. You asked me to give you the record of liberalism, and you asked me to give you the record of liberalism, because the conjuring trip that both of you do is to look at all the bad elements in the society, in the world today, and say, all the bad things are because of liberalism. None of the good things are because of liberalism. And somehow the world was better at some other time. At least that's what Curtis seems to suggest. And that is just not the case. Look at the year 1800. Look at the year 1750, before liberal thought actually had an influence in the world. You had horrible, extreme forms of injustice and hierarchy all around the world. There was barely a place in the world where you could speak your mind freely, where you could print whatever book you wanted without censorship, where you could practice your faith as you wanted. Slavery was a practice not just in the United States, but across the Arab world, across huge swaths of the world. Women had no rights to political participation in virtually every society around the world. And then what happened? Well, societies are deeply imperfect, and it takes a lot of fighting to improve them. And there's real injustices today. But actually, because of liberal political views, because of fighting for the values that every individual, irrespective of their race, creed, gender, and so on, should be free to live their life as they wish, we now are much closer, far away, but much closer to the ideal of empowering people to lead in these self-determined ways than were 200 years ago. So I'm willing to defend the record of liberalism any time of the day.
All right, Yascha, we'll hold it there. And a last word on this particular bit. Curtis, you wanted to come back on.
First of all, to Yascha, I'm quite sure that Jane Austen could not have imagined an England in which she could be arrested for her tweets. And
that's very hard to imagine on several different levels.
Indeed. Or her novels, And I think the idea of, I'm not sure Yascha is a historian or has studied history, but his vision of 18th century England as a place of, domination as though it was being run by Metternich or something is, it seems very ahistorical to me. But I also find Amina's, historical take relatively ahistorical because, if I look at basically pre-European societies, let's take pre-European societies in Africa. For me, feminism and black nationalism and various sort of Marxist ideologies are all just as imported to Africa as liberalism. These are newer imports. Frantz Fanon was not an African. And when I look at basically African societies that are pre-European and cultural and political traditions of, look at the Kingdom of Benin, right? Do you really want to bring back the Kingdom of Benin?
I think that's an area perhaps that opens up vast areas of discussion to do with history and all kinds of things.
I would like to
very briefly, because I do want to move on a bit.
Briefly respond because both Yascha and Curtis have been making claims, putting words in my mouth that I haven't said. I mean, I did point out that there are some positive advantages, for one, and also with regard to Africa. I mean, there's this constant worldview by Westerners that positions Africans as though we are an asteroid in outer space. Like feminism, from its very inception, was an international women's movement. And there were a lot of African women who, in the early 20th century, were actually traveling to Russia, to America, and so on. So, feminism does not really belong to the West. And yes, it was influenced by liberalism, but there's also been corresponding conversations about it in Africa.
All right. We will open up another area of the argument, because I know this can go on in all sorts of directions. I wanted to look at the theme of freedom, actually, because related to liberalism. Does liberalism allow for the only freedom which deserves the name? And is it, as a result,
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.